Yes, folks, it's time for Brian and I to punish ourselves by reviewing the 2004 Punisher and Punisher Warzone. This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week. Just like last week, we are making two superhero films this week and decide whether they should be in the Pantheon, the pile of shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5 star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at The Real World are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you could do so in two ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon@gmail.com, or you can find us on Twitter at HeroPantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. And Brian, last week, we reviewed a movie that I don't think was nearly as bad as I remembered it and thought it would be, and we reviewed A Complete Disaster, and we are going to be kind of following that same formula this week, as we will be reviewing a movie that it's not terrible, and then we're going to review a movie that I personally think was pretty distasteful in Punisher Warzone. But first, we're going to talk about Punisher 2004, a movie that I have seen before, but literally have no memory of until I rewatched it.
First time I'd ever watched it. And it's kind of crazy because it's been around for so long, 16 years. You figured I'd watch the Punisher movie by now, but I didn't, especially with Kevin Nash in it. And the only scene I knew about was the Kevin Nash fight scene, and that was it. So, yeah, I'm not impressed, man. Thomas Jane, wow. I was not impressed as him as Frank Castle. Very disappointed, to be honest, because I know he's a good. He's not great, but he's good. Like, I like him in Hung when he did that show, Boogie Nights. I'm forgetting another Thomas Jane thing here, but he's really good. But here's Frank Castle. He's just I don't know. I don't know if he got to the heart of the character or not. I mean, he was doing the drinking and all that stuff, and he loves wild turkey, but I don't know, man. Thomas James, Frank Castle doesn't do it for me. Man, I just wish Lou Gossett Jr. was just in every single Punisher movie so they were more easier to digest, because it's almost like he was so good in that 89 one. I wanted someone to be that good in every single next Punisher movie to kind of help me like sit through it. But no, it was just shitty performances in this one. I guess shitty performances in the next one too. But damn, man, I wish Lou Gossett Jr. was like in every single Punisher movie, kind of like Dr. Loomis in the Halloween series. You know what I mean?
Never thought we would get to that reference, but here we are. I would agree with you that he certainly would have made both of these movies significantly better. I guess where we are going to diverge is our thoughts on Thomas Jane, because as we get into the heroes category, again, we're just going to kind of jump right into things. I think what we see here is a much more toned down Frank Castle from the 1989 version. He starts off this movie, he is actually in the FBI, and we don't really see him kill anyone until toward the end of the movie. And I think part of what makes Frank Castle so different from the first movie is that he's not an assassin when he starts. Again, he's this undercover character, and we see him kind of manipulate his way through things and successfully complete this underground mission, or this undercover mission. But ultimately, it didn't work. Or it did work, but his family gets stalked and they get murdered mercilessly in what's just a really horrendous scene to watch. I mean, the execution of the scene is perfectly acceptable, but I mean, it was just torturous getting through some of this. And at 2 hours and 4 minutes, I know that Matt Waters' gimmick is he's kind of the one that talks about movies being too long, but I mean, I felt like this movie was just way too long. And while I appreciate the fact that we did get to see kind of the beginnings of Frank Castle in this case, and he's not just a murderer to start things out. We see him, the fact that he does have a family, the fact that he does care about his family, and we kind of see him engaging in those kinds of behaviors. But then we see him make this turn, and it is genuinely amusing to me that the first thing he does is burn money. And one of the things that I was wondering about is, did he read Karl Marx in his time when he was officially dead? Because, I mean, it just feels like he's not only anti-gangster, but perhaps anti-capitalism as well. And that's something, Brian, that I think we can relate to at this point. And then he kind of creates this found family at the apartment building. I think he's got some solid one-liners. I like Thomas Jane in this role, and it sounds like I like him more than you because we get to see him actually acting. He's not just a murderer. He's not just a killing machine. He has actual dialogue. He's able to converse with other actors, which is something that I cannot say for either of the other Punishers, really. And I think in this movie, he is the most realized as a person as opposed to just being the Punisher.
Yeah, I get that, and I get why they did the whole backstory and the origin story, and they give you that sympathy, and it's very like disturbing when I watch that scene because it's not just his family that he killed; it's a whole family reunion that he's at. So it's like the whole, I don't know, 20 or so family members just destroyed by gunfire, and that was really hard to watch personally. But um, I mean, I get why they did it. I can't buy into him with the family, like his new family at the apartment building, because I just felt like he just never talked to them at all, and they just accepted him as like a member of their family. And I was like, okay, you're kind of pushing it there with the whole family thing. But I just felt like his performance was not at the level that I just expected. I don't know what it was. I thought something was missing. I don't know if he just didn't have the right. I don't know, like he didn't really embody the Frank Castle that I picture. It's more, I don't know, I guess more of the more recent one from the show because he's like Thomas Jane isn't as jacked as I think he could be for the role. I think you got to be kind of like jacked to be Frank Castle to a certain extent.
I completely disagree with that. I actually think that part of the idea of Frank Castle is that he is kind of this normal looking guy. And I would say that I'm not going to say that he can't be muscular, but that is not something that I would hold against him because part of the gimmick of the Punisher is that he gets punished and he doesn't that's not what he needs to be. He's a smart tactical person given that his background, and he is very good with guns and weaponry and things like that. And there is the scene with Kevin Nash, but for the most part it's not even about hand-to-hand combat. It's just being good in other ways and smart.
Yeah, I get that too. It's just I feel like every time he's punching dudes and like knocking dudes out, it's like a one punch thing with except the Kevin Nash part. But like it feels like he just overpowers everyone. But then when I look at Thomas Jane, it doesn't look like he's the kind of guy that will overpower a group of people in a fight. And I guess that's just the way he looks. But that's just me because like I just can't buy into his look as the Punisher, even though he's got the full dress and the nice costume at the end. I like that little touch. There's just something missing about his performance. And I don't know what it is for me personally. I don't know if he needed to be more like into the PTSD side of things and just kind of be like shaking or whatever. But I just felt like something was missing, and that kind of hurt the performance for me. And then you got Ben Foster here as one of his friends from the apartment building, and I'm just like, God, he's such a talent. But then you realize it's 2004, and that's before like 3:10 to Yuma and all these other movies that he got popular in. And he's such a great talent, but I felt like he was just wasted in this role. And it's weird too because I think Triple H and Batista have seen this movie a lot because their boy Kevin Nash is in it, and they ripped off the scene of the dude ripping off the dude's piercings with the pliers, and they did that exact thing in the WrestleMania match last year. So I don't know what that says.
Wow, I never thought you'd be able to connect this movie to that match, but here we are. And I don't know. I think I'm going to disagree with you again on Ben Foster. I think that his role is kind of being a supporting player, and I think he does as good of a job bringing pathos to that character as is reasonable. I don't think that his character is designed to be a focal point of this movie. And I think that's okay. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, especially in a movie that is about the Punisher. You want a lot of the focus to be on the Punisher. So I don't necessarily have a problem with Ben Foster's character. I think where I come down very hard on this movie is the way the female characters are portrayed. And I think this is just totally inexcusable. I think the fact that his wife, who is played by Samantha Mathis, playing his wife Maria, and his child Marcus Johns is Will, they're specifically there to die, and they draw it out over the first 30 minutes of the movie. I was stunned when they were still alive at like the 20-minute mark, because you know what's going to happen to these characters, and the fact that they were just drawing this out was just, it was insane to me that they did this. And then the way that they did it with them getting away and then being run over, but they're not really showing a lot. So it's seemingly like this movie, which I think has a lot of tonal problems anyway. It feels like they want to do this kind of dark and gritty movie on the one hand, but they also don't want to be violent. They're like going for this soft R, and it really doesn't work. You have Rebecca Romijn in this movie, and undoubtedly she does not want to put the Mystique outfit on again, and she is as herself, or looks like herself, and I think she is perfectly fine as Joan. But to me, it's like they wanted specifically to have someone that looks similar to Maria, and again, just this idea of disposable female characters. That's the part of the movie that really bothered me. And I think that a lot of the other characters in this movie, besides Thomas Jane's Punisher, Frank Castle, and Ben Foster as Dave, I think a lot of those characters are left by the wayside, and they're not real characters. And I think that's really unfortunate.
Yeah, and you mentioned disposable female characters, not to mention the wife that gets literally disposed of at the end of the movie off a bridge for no reason at all. But we'll get to that in the villain score, because that was just fucking terrible. But yeah, for me, Thomas Jane as the Punisher, I don't know. Maybe he needs another chance. Maybe it's the Brandon Routh thing, and I just don't like him the first time around, and you just got to get used to it. Maybe I'll watch the short film that he did like way after in 2012 to kind of get, I don't know, back into that. But for me, with these like side characters that are not really fully developed, you know what I mean? And it's just like, I don't know. I couldn't buy another family gathering kind of shit going on in the movie. Rebecca Romijn, she's good. It's just like, I just felt like they could have done so much more with her character, but at the same time, it's just kind of like, it's just that female love interest to kind of keep him grounded and kind of remind him of his humanity kind of thing, and I get that, but I don't know, because I felt like they just had those side characters and just left them in the apartment, and that was all they were meant to be. It's just the apartment characters, you know what I mean? And they really had nothing to do with almost like the overall plot. You could have just wrote them out and think it would have been the same movie, but it is what it is.
So there is one cameo, and that's what it is. It is a bona fide cameo. Do you want to talk about Roy Scheider?
It's a little more than a cameo, you know what I mean? But I was shocked because I was like, do we need a bigger boat here? Like, what's going on? Like, and I looked it up and I was like, God, he died 4 years after this, and he looked like pretty good. I mean, they did a good makeup job on him. They made him look a little bit younger. But goddamn, man, he's my boy. I love him in Jaws. Jaws is one of my all-time favorites. And yeah, man, he was kicking ass. Even at, I don't even know how old he was at this time, but he died 4 years later, and he was still like shooting people on screen. So good for him.
So yeah, I'm very interested to know your score now, because I think this is one of those occasions that almost never happens, where my score is going to be higher than yours, and I'm curious to see by how much. I'm giving this a 5 because I really did appreciate what Thomas Jane was doing as the Punisher. I don't think it was extraordinary, but I certainly think it was solid. I think where points are lost is the disposability of the female characters, the FBI agents being pretty much incompetent, and a lot of those issues. But I will give this a 5. I think it was definitely better than last week's Punisher that we talked about.
I'll go with a 3. I think I like Dolph Lundgren more than Thomas Jane, and I don't know what it is. Maybe he's just got that look that I envisioned for Frank Castle, but maybe that's just me. You know what I mean? And I guess the blonde hair at the beginning didn't really help things either, and then he switches her back to black, so that got me confused too. But yeah, I mean, is what it is. The point difference ain't that big of a deal, or not big of a difference, but I still wasn't overly impressed. So.
All right, so we've been talking for about 10 to 15 minutes about this movie, and now it is time to talk about John Travolta. This is going to be our one and only time to discuss John Travolta. And for our younger listeners, it is really hard to talk about just what a big deal John Travolta was. Even before Brian and I were born, John Travolta was a huge star because he literally went from Welcome Back, Kotter, doing that TV show, to becoming the biggest movie star in the world, doing Saturday Night Fever and Grease back to back. And then his kind of career went into a bit of a nosedive, kind of up and down, and there were a lot of misses and there were a couple hits thrown in there. But then he makes this enormous comeback in the 1994 movie Pulp Fiction. Quentin Tarantino has a reputation for resurrecting careers, and this is one of the many occasions when he did just that. So John Travolta becomes this enormous movie star once again. He does a couple of big hits, including Face Off and Michael and Phenomenon, and he does some of these movies where, he's getting some credibility back. And this is kind of one of those situations where it feels like John Travolta is very much about to hit the downswing of his career. And I'll be honest, it's really hard for me to say this because I think he's been in some good stuff. But after watching this, I am totally convinced that John Travolta is not a good actor, and he really is not very good as Howard Saint. Just the delivery of his dialogue, it's just comical.
I think that's just the direction. I think it's just poor direction because I think back when he started, he was pretty damn good. Like I remember watching Welcome Back, Carter on like Nick at Night and all that shit, and he's just so funny on that, and his voice is like different, but it's like a different tone. I think he's just good at like comedy acting. You know what I mean? Like I know Saturday Night Fever is not a comedy, obviously, but I mean I've only seen clips of that, but he seems really good in that too. And then I look, I'm a fan of. I'm not a big fan of Grease, but I like the movie. It's like it's fun and watchable, and he's really good at that too. So I don't know what it is, but maybe after Battlefield Earth, maybe that's when it kind of went to shit on his performances. But then I don't remember anything from the '80s from him anyway. So, but Pulp Fiction, he was fucking great. So it's hard, man. It's hard to say that because I feel like the first half of his career he was really good. It's just the second half he just kind of lost himself, and then nowadays we're ending up with like him being directed by Fred Durst in a really weird movie. So.
And Gotti, how could you forget Gotti, Brian?
Oh, is that the one that got like a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes?
It absolutely got a 0 on Rotten Tomatoes and is not good. So let's get into kind of the more specifics of the villains. It is teased at some point that his wife, Olivia Saint, who's playing Laura, is having an affair with Quentin Glass, who's played by Will Patton, but the latter turns out to be gay, which is really interesting given the rumors surrounding John Travolta. Any thoughts on this, Brian?
I had the same thought as you, like, wait a minute, this is kind of like some meta shit going on. But maybe he just, maybe that was just coincidence and he accepted the script and read that part of the script and it was like, okay. But maybe it's just coincidence. I don't know. But we've heard the rumors and, yeah, it is what it is. If he wants to do that and live in the closet, I guess that's up to him. But, and it's 2020. I think, if he wanted to, some people would be shocked. Not a lot of people would be shocked. But at this point, he's married, I think, still, and is what it is. So
it is. I cannot watch John Travolta, and it's really hard to watch Tom Cruise without thinking of the South Park episode "Trapped in the Closet."
Oh man, wow, that's also an R. Kelly reference, which we should not mention.
I mean, that's why I didn't say R. Kelly's name, but it is logical too, since that is the name of the song. And it's amusing to me how this movie starts because Howard Saint, we kind of establish him as kind of this really evil guy. I mean, the guy literally could probably get a mustache tutorial and it would be less subtle than what they were going for here. He decides to kill Castle's family because his wife says so. And I am convinced, Brian, that this movie would have been significantly better if Will Patton was the lead villain. I think he's kind of that guy. He is in a lot of movies. It's interesting to me the connections that exist between Will Patton and the director of this movie. The director of this movie has a lot of connections to Michael Bay, which is not a surprise because I think there are times when this movie kind of feels a little bit like a low-rent Michael Bay movie. And the fact that Will Patton kind of gets a big role and you have this person who is connected with Armageddon. I don't think that's any secret as to why Will Patton was in this role, but I think he is one of the best parts of this movie. In fact, I think the performance. I think he's evil. I think his tone matches kind of with the movie, which I think is really hard. And yeah, I think that I have a lot of issues with the villain part, especially because, again, I don't think John Travolta is very good, but I think Will Patton is very good.
I'll agree with that. He might be the best performance in this movie, I think. I like him as the henchman. I like the cover up. It's just weird. Like they did this whole side plot about Frank Castle trying to convince Travolta's character that his wife's having the affair with the henchman, but like at no point do they actually resolve it because you never actually find out what the wife was doing on those Thursday nights at the maybe she was just at the movies and that was the whole point. And then and Travolta just got uber paranoid, right? But I don't know. I felt like that was just such a filler plot. You know what I mean? Just to get to those two people getting killed. And then the wife asking to kill the whole just kill Frank Castle's whole family because my son got accidentally killed in a drug deal that he was involved in. I just felt like that was just so too much of a stretch for me because it would have been one thing if Castle actually shot his kid, but he didn't. It was like the FBI and all that kind of thing during the sting. So I don't know. Like it was just weird that they put all the blame on Castle and then annihilating 20 members of his family for it. Just way too much, way too an overreaction, I think, from the villains. But at the same time, it's like it's a wacky villain kind of reaction. And Travolta's accent is terrible in this. I don't even know if it's an accent. I think it's just the way he thinks that gangster should talk or an Italian gangster should talk, and he just doesn't nail it. Yeah, and then him screaming at the end, attached to the trunk of that car while it's on fire, and him groaning. That was like the most cringe-worthy thing in this movie, I think. And that's all John Travolta's acting right there. But like I said, like I like him when he's younger, but in this role, in this later stages of his career, it's just like he doesn't know what he's doing, I think.
Yeah, I think that it's clear to me that they really did not know what to do with the ending. I believe there were some budget problems, and that's probably why this ending is it's pretty bad. And the one thing I will say though, there is one scene that I really like, and I'm curious to see where you're going to fall in this. Kevin Nash, of course, plays a random Russian. He literally has no name. His character is literally called the Russian, and I really like the action scene with Frank Castle. I think it's possible to say it went on too long, but I appreciate the fact that the action scene told the story and there were kind of ups and downs, and that Frank Castle was an underdog, because one of the complaints that I had last week was that Dolph Lundgren is such a tall man that it's impossible to see him as this underdog hero. But in this case, Kevin Nash is a giant, and Thomas Jane is not a small man by any means, but here he got to play that underdog role. And I think if they were making the argument that Frank Castle is a hero, this was probably the place to do it, because this Russian just randomly attacks him, goes after his found family, and he has to kill him. And I really like that scene. I think it's one of the best scenes in the movie. And even though I don't think this movie is particularly good, I really like the physicality that Kevin Nash brought to this role. And I am not being sarcastic. I am being 100% serious.
Hey, I believe you, man. Look, it was straight up like a wrestling match. And let's just face it, like Kevin Nash had his best match. I know we're going on a wrestling tangent here, but Kevin Nash had his best matches with Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. They were smaller dudes who were more athletic and kind of do things around him to make him look good. And this is exactly that. It was a Kevin Nash, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels match, just put in a fight scene with Thomas Jane. So there you go. That's why it worked. And let's not forget the dude with the guitar, who was obviously like almost like a reference to the Desperado series, because I was like, oh my God, is this a guitar case full of guns? No, it was just a guitar case with a guitar. But I did like the fact that you had this random, like, I don't know, like country western singer slash, I don't know, like killer, I guess you'd say. And then, yeah, that was kind of my favorite part of the movie, because that was the most interesting part, because I was like, okay, this guy's like a crazy dude who's playing random guitar songs and killing people, and he's an assassin. I'm digging this. And then 5 minutes later, he's gone. So that was like kind of disappointing. And he's on the villain side too, so you got to include that. But he was very interesting. I have no idea who that guy was, but he seems like an actual country music star or something like that, and that was kind of cool.
Yeah, I would say that. So I'm actually going to upgrade my villain score. I originally had something else written, but I'm also going to give the villain score a 5 because you have made the argument that I think the guitar guy was really cool. I really like the scene with the Russian. I think Will Patton is good. John Travolta pretty much means I cannot go any higher than a 5, though.
See, the thing is like I wanted to give this a higher score because of the crazy guitar guy and Kevin Nash, but Travolta just lowers the scores for me so much. So I'm gonna go with a 2. I was thinking about giving it a 4 or 5 too, but I was just like, I can't do it, man, because Travolta was just so bad it drags everything down. And the guitar guy was only like 5 minutes, so you know what I mean? It's just like I wish the movie was more like random assassins coming after Frank Castle as opposed to just the two of them. And like, if you know the Frank Castle's address, why don't you just send like 200 guys to the fucking apartment building as opposed to just one dude? I don't get it. Like, they knew where he was living the whole time, and yet they just played this game with him.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me that we are so divergent in our scores. Let's see what happens with the story. I think the tone of this movie is all over the place, and it's funny. I think all three Punishers have a really bad tone problem. They really draw out the deaths of Castle's family. They essentially murder not only the core family but numerous other older people too. I mean, I think in an era of mass shootings, this really, to me, that entire scene where they're just getting blown away, that stuff really has not aged very well.
No, that was very hard to watch, to be honest. And I maybe in 2004 it wasn't as, but now with with this whole major, nationwide PTSD thing because of guns and everything. Like I mentioned last week's podcast, you saw the journalist running to the building that's being shot at and being blown up, as opposed to running away from it. That was the culture, I guess, in '89. But now it's very different now, and that was very hard to watch. And just some of the story elements, just like I don't know, like the logic thing, it keeps bothering me. Like I mentioned, like they knew where Frank Castle was living, and then all of a sudden Frank Castle has other family that we really didn't like. We never really got to see them connect as a family, yet they just call him as a member of the family. I thought that was kind of weird. Um, and then, like I mentioned, like only the friends of his family, his new family, they only stay at the apartment. They don't they hardly ever leave the building, so it was kind of like one location, kind of a budget issue there. Just weird stuff with the story, and I like some of the ideas, but the fact that like we gotta have Frank Castle not just lose his two kids and his wife, but we gotta have him lose his whole family this time and make it seem so over the top. And then Frank Castle should be dead. Like, there's no way he could have survived all that shit that he got shot at, like 4 times, getting shot at by like I think once with like a shotgun, and like he doesn't even go to a hospital. He just heals up over like God knows how many months. It should take him like 2 years to recover for something like that, and yet he's there. I don't know how many days or months later, and he's just ready to go back at it. So that threw me off as well. Um, and I don't know, a family reunion in Puerto Rico. Who's got that kind of money, man? Who's got that kind of money?
I mean, clearly they do. I mean, that was a really nice setup they had going on, and you gotta appreciate that effort. But what I do not appreciate, and this is why my story score is going to be extremely low, the way the female characters are treated in this movie is just awful. And you have the scene at the end when Saint calls his wife a whore for sleeping with someone. He throws her over the ledge, and then she gets run over by a train. I mean, it's just. I understand that these are the heels, the bad guys, the bad girls, so to speak, but just the way that they treated her specifically, it was just really gross. Because it seemed like they gave her a little bit of agency at the beginning, and then just tore it all away at the end. You could say that the same thing for Maria and Joan. I mean, it feels like they were almost disposable in the way that they were portrayed in this movie. They were kind of Frank's girl, regardless of whether they were romantic or not. And this movie does not come anywhere close to passing the Bechdel test. So that's kind of where I am with the female characters. Brian, I know that you really did not like this ending. So I want you to paint a picture for our listeners and describe what made the ending so bad, and then we can reveal our scores, because I have a feeling we will agree on how bad the story is.
Well, the ending was kind of anticlimactic because he kind of just went in there, threw a bomb, and then just nailed or annihilated everyone. Had almost no trouble doing it. It almost felt like Kevin Nash was the main, like thing to get in the way, and then he got it. Once Kevin Nash was out of the way, everything was just easy, right? And then you got John Travolta strapped to the back of a car that's being with the gas pedal stuck, held down, and the car's just moving, and it's about to blow up, and then he blows up all these other cars around him, and then you hear John Travolta squealing like, I don't even know how to describe it. It's the worst cringeworthy sound I've heard in a movie in quite some time. And like it was just so hard to watch because it was such a bad scene. And then John Travolta blows up and that's about it. And yeah, that's the best way I can describe it. Just John Travolta moaning in the most obnoxious, weird way.
Yeah, it's very, very strange. I gave the story a 3 because, again, for so many reasons, I think the fact that this movie is over 2 hours long is offensive. I think there are two really good scenes, and then there's just a lot of mediocrity surrounding those two scenes.
A 3 as well. I just felt like they had some filler. Like you said, the beginning was too long. Like the family should have been killed in like a flashback sequence. Like just wrap it up quick, nothing too disturbing, and they made it just really disturbing with Roy Scheider there. So that was kind of out of nowhere. And then, like I said, the ending was just bad. It's just overall the story is not that good, and they just try to fill it up with like, interesting plot filler that goes nowhere with the wife, pretty much, because we still never find out what the hell she was doing. I guess she was just going to the movies every Thursday.
I mean, she's a cinephile, Brian. What can you say? You can't critique that. I mean, here we are talking about movies every week. Maybe, in 2019, 20, she might have her own podcast.
Yeah, I believe that. It's just weird that like, oh man, I wish she had Movie Pass back then. That would have been easier for her.
Would have been much easier because then she could have proved the fact that she was not cheating on her husband by showing the movie tickets.
You would think of something like that, but again, logic in this movie is not that great.
Perhaps not. Let's go over the technical aspects of this movie. To me, this kind of felt like a low-rent Tony Scott, Michael Bay effort in kind of the way things were shot and the way things looked. I think the score is pretty generic. It's nothing too special. A couple of good action scenes, especially the fight between Castle and the Russian. I mean, I wish I had more to say about the technical aspects, but it's very, very forgettable. The one thing I will say about Warzone is at least it's not forgettable. But in this case, I am settling on a 5.
4. I did like the score a little bit. Like the score was kind of doing this like Italian kind of like mobster kind of score, but then again, it's just like it didn't feel like it fit some of the tone of the movie, so that kind of threw it off. Like it fit some of the mob scenes, right? But it didn't fit the rest of the movie. So that was kind of weird. I didn't like the lighting in this movie at all. Everything was just way too dark. And I get they want a dark movie, but it's just some of it was just hard to like focus on. And I didn't like any of the lighting in a lot of the scenes. And then, you don't get the full suit until the end. So yeah, it wasn't, it wasn't technically great. Yeah, I give it a 4. So.
All right, let's talk about the legacy of this movie. That's it's been forgotten by so many people. And I think this is probably the closest to an MCU version of the Punisher as you ever see, because he is not nearly as hardcore or violent as he was in the 1989 or 2008 version. I could almost see this version of the Punisher making it into an MCU movie. This did not make a great deal of money. It seems trapped between the PG-13 and R rating. There really isn't a lot of hard R stuff, but it still was rated R. This came out at a time when superhero movies were becoming popular, but Marvel was just a few years away from kind of regaining or having control over most of its characters. So we're kind of talking about kind of a weird zone for movies, because of course you had X-Men, which was a big hit, Spider-Man, which came out, and then you got this, which is kind of trying to straddle the line. And I don't think it was very successful. So my legacy score is a 4.
Same. It would have been much higher if they did the rumored crossover with Spider-Man 2. I don't know if you've seen that clip that went viral like maybe a year ago, and then it goes viral every couple of years. But like, I guess it was a deleted scene or something where in the background you see this guy looking at Peter Parker, or maybe it was Mary Jane with Peter Parker like taking the picture or something like that. But it's supposed to be Frank Castle in the background or something like that. So imagine if they did that crossover, because obviously they were planning something, but then I guess Lionsgate had the rights and you really couldn't do it. But yeah, it's just that would have been something, you know what I mean? But Thomas Jane coming back as the Punisher, and let's go with that new Punisher from the show now and let him be the Punisher and cross him over into the movies. So let's go with that. And my legacy's a 4. It's just like, I think the only thing that I remember, I guess that's being a wrestling fan, is just Kevin Nash was in this movie. That's how people remember it. So I don't know what that says about me.
Yeah, I mean Kevin Nash had his head shaved for this movie, if you remember that.
Yeah, and then he was working with TNA at the time, and then they mentioned that and tried to do this cross promotion thing, and because it was TNA, no one cared.
Exactly. So my total score is a 22.
Mine's a 16.
Wow, this is definitely unusual. Usually it's you that has the higher score, but in my case, I have the higher ground this time, and I'm about 6 points higher than you. This is a very interesting situation. I think the reality of this is that when we are at a point when in talking about some of these Marvel movies that do not necessarily work, and it's really sad that they don't, because I think there was potential here. I don't think that this movie is devoid of value. I think there were some solid performances. I don't think that this movie was as far away from being good as even the 1989 version, because I don't know if it was necessarily a budget problem. I think if they got rid of John Travolta, or if they did a couple of other things, I think this movie could have been good. And it's unfortunate because I think Thomas Jane could have grown into this role, and he could probably still be playing it. Maybe, I mean, maybe a little bit older, but perhaps I think it could have worked. But I I feel like our total score is a 38. I think about a 40 out of a 100 is appropriate. I don't think this movie is anywhere close to pile of shame worthy, but I certainly think that it is not without its problems either.
Yeah, and I guess this is just me being weird, but I think I prefer the 89 version over this, but that's just me having a different aesthetic and I guess having a fondness for Dolph Lundgren. So there you go.
All right, let us transition into talking about Punisher Warzone, a movie that came out around Christmas time 2008. I cannot believe the amount of superhero movies that have come out this year, and we're still not done with the year 2008, Brian. If you can believe it, we still have one more after this.
I know, Hancock, and I can't believe that I forgot about that movie too. But yeah, I was thinking the same thing, man. Like Dark Knight, Iron Man, Punisher, Hancock, Hellboy 2, and there's probably something else that I'm not even thinking of that we're not even thinking of. But it was loaded that year for superhero movies. And like, I don't know, I just felt like I remember this at the time coming out, and it was like a Blockbuster exclusive, and they really, like, it really got a big push on home video because it flopped. And I was thinking, like, man, like, people aren't confused. Like, I'm confused. Like, is this a sequel? Is this a reboot? And then the people who watched it, I was talking to these customers at Blockbuster, and they're like, yeah, it was enjoyable. It has great action, but as like a rental, it's like, it's fine. So I was like, okay. And then I never watched it until now, and I watch it now, and I was like, I see why this got a cold following. I see why people praise Lexi Alexander, and I felt like after watching this, like she should have got more opportunities, man, because she took like chicken shit and turned it into chicken salad. It's passable. It's not a great movie by any stretch. It's like a one-time viewing kind of movie, but she made it so passable. Like it reminded me of the work that I forget his name, but the guy who directed Jurassic World 2. Like despite how shitty that movie is, Jurassic World 2 is like extremely well directed, right? So I felt like she can direct very well, and she directed a lot of these scenes very well, despite the obstacles against her.
It is fascinating to me that you have this very positive viewpoint of this movie, because this was a chore to watch for me, and I really didn't like it. And I sometimes I will do research before the movie and kind of read up on it. Sometimes I'll do it after. This happened to be a case where I was reading about the movie afterward. I didn't even realize that the person who directed this movie was a woman. I don't know what that says about this movie specifically, but to me, this came across like a movie where there were clearly budget problems, there were clearly tone problems, and it was very strange the way that this movie came across. And it's almost like they try to create an independent version of a superhero movie. And I think there are certain cases where I would like to see that experimented more. Like a Batman movie to me does not have to be $150 million budget. Just doesn't need that. I kind of would love to see what a $10 million Batman movie would look like, where he's being a detective and they're kind of taking away kind of the frills and just doing a kind of a straightforward story. In this case, the budget is not necessarily the problem. The problem is just some of the casting choices, and it feels like things got out of control. And I think what happens with directors in her situation is that with these superhero movies, there's so much pressure to deliver. And at a point in 2008, it's a few years after the first Punisher. Lionsgate is a studio that does not have a lot of franchises, so I can imagine there being a lot more pressure on her and for this movie to succeed. I think there are certain aspects of this movie that have been used by Netflix particularly. I think Netflix adapted their TV shows to look very similar to this movie. Unfortunately, it did not work for me. I think that is the fundamental problem. This movie, I know that there are a lot of people who can watch movies, intentionally bad movies, and they like them in an ironic way. I am generally not one of those people. If a movie is bad, I generally have a hard time watching it because it's bad. And I don't like badness. And maybe that is a character flaw of mine. But that's why this particularly was a really negative experience for me. And kind of the random violence. I mean, I don't know what it is about me. I'm not a prude, certainly, but the way that the violence is done in this movie and kind of the fetishizing of guns and things like that, I don't know, man. Like, it's just not something that I'm as into as perhaps I was in my younger days.
Yeah, this is very much, I want to say, a product of its time, because like Crank was like a big kind of like indie hit like 2 years prior, and that has that same kind of like excessive over the top violence. And then you had a movie with Clive Owen called Shoot 'Em Up, again same over the top kind of violence. It just seemed to be like the kind of the way that the action movie was going at the time. And you can see it in this movie for sure. It's just like, we're gonna shoot people in the most craziest ways because no one's seen that before, and then that's what they're doing. And then the John Wick kind of took that and evolved the style a little bit and made it more um, storytelling elements inside like the choreography of the fighting, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like the John Wick style is more of like the modern fighting movie action sequence style, and that it tells more of a story in that. Here, it's just like, we're going to do things in a really cool way and do things cool visually that you haven't seen before and go over the top and go super bloody. And we're going to blow up a kid, doing parkour in between a building with a rocket, shit like that. And I was just like, okay, man, I get it. This was like so 2007, 2008. I remember really being into those super action movies at the time that were coming out and just like enjoying it because like I'd never seen any action movies like that before. And then, you realize you just go back and everyone's just kind of copying John Woo from like the early 90s. But again, it is what it is on the action sequences. But I don't know. I don't like a lot of the performances in this movie, but I just felt like she did a hell of a job of what she did and kind of like saved this from being a total disaster. I don't think it was a total disaster. Because like I see why people like this movie, and I don't think they like it like ironically. I think they like it because of the action sequences and the way that Frank Castle's like killing people. I think that's the draw and the appeal. But I think that's just because like it just looks cool visually. You know what I mean? And that Kill Bill kind of like, whoa, kind of like that looks cool kind of style. So I think that's what it is.
Yeah, I definitely saw a little bit of John Wick in this movie as well, and I think that's something that certainly has been done better by those movies. And I think what's interesting, so when we go through my scores, it's going to be fascinating because the legacy score is by far my highest, and I will be very curious to see how your legacy score shakes out. So for me, let's just get into the categories. I think Ray Stevenson is woefully miscast as Punisher. I think almost everybody in this movie is miscast. Ray Stevenson is not American. I think his American accent is pretty bad, and he can barely hide the fact that he is not from this country. And I'm not even necessarily saying that he has to be. I think it certainly would help, given the Punisher is supposed to be a former FBI agent. But I think in this particular case, it just does not work. And I appreciated the fact that he did try to play the Punisher as very tortured, but his emotional palette to me is almost impenetrable because he does not really talk for the first 20 minutes of the movie. I don't know about you, Brian, but that opening action scene, I was getting serious McBain from The Simpsons vibes. I don't know about you. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Mendoza! Yeah, I do. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, he's not that good. And it's not that he's not good as an actor. He's just not good as a leading role, I don't think. Because, like, all I remember him is just being the side character in Thor, right? And I think he's just been in a bunch of side stuff as well. But him as a leading guy does not work, especially if you don't have like the charisma to lead like an not an MCU, but like a Marvel type movie. You know what I mean? Like you have to have some kind of charisma, I think. And I think maybe that was lacking with Thomas Jane as well. Maybe that's why I didn't really like that as much. But here it's just like it's almost worse. And it sucks because like he's got this cool badass demeanor, but he doesn't even look like Frank Castle. He looks like a dude in a technical thing, and like you could have named this a different movie, and it would have been like it didn't have to be the Punisher. It would have been the same movie, and you could have just done the same story, and have him be this other character, and not necessarily be the Punisher. You know what I mean? But it doesn't work in terms of him being a leading role because again, like I noticed that too. Like I timed it, like the 25 minutes in, he says something, and I was like, God, he shouldn't have just said anything throughout the whole movie. I think that would have been even more intriguing and better. But yeah, I get where they're doing. He's trying to. I think Lexi Alexander like casted him because he kind of has this like Clint Eastwood gunslinger thing going on, but I don't think that's the type of person Frank Castle is. He's not the quiet gunslinger type. He's more of like a deeply tortured soul. You know what I mean? That can't has to deal with his past and that kind of thing. And you don't really see him like do that. You see him a couple times, kind of dealing with that, and him like crying at the fucking at his wife's grave or whatever, and that was kind of interesting. But I felt like, yeah, you're right. He doesn't really get that emotional tone that a Frank Castle needs.
Right. And I definitely I think that torture aspect of things is such an important part of this character, and I think it's really hard to get that across. And I think other than Frank Castle, I think just like all of the other Punisher movies, I think the other characters they don't work. Julie Benz, almost unrecognizable as Angela. Did you realize that was Julie Benz, by the way?
Who? Who's Julie Benz?
Julie Benz from Dexter, Angel. I'm actually surprised you don't know who she is.
Oh, okay. I know you're talking. Yeah, I wasn't a fan of Dexter, so I watched the pilot of Dexter, and I felt like, yeah, I don't know if I want to watch people get tortured every episode. But I heard it wasn't as bad. But I know who you're talking about now, and yeah, the this was that time, 2007, 2008, so that makes perfect sense of the timeline.
Yeah, so it's really bizarre to just see her in this role with very jet black hair, and I think she's almost trying to go for the same thing Rebecca Romaine was going for in the previous movie, and I don't think it works out. She also has a really bad accent, and she has no agency whatsoever. She spends a lot of this movie in distress between her husband dying, having a gun held to her head, or being held captive as she was toward the end of this movie. The second Punisher movie to have Frank Castle want to be shot by someone, and in this case, the kid was watching, not pointing the gun. How has this happened?
I don't know, man. I guess I guess they just wanted to pay homage or something. Because it felt like there was that other cop too that wanted to hunt Frank Castle down, and it seemed like he was the same character that Lou Gossett was playing from '89. So I don't know. There was a lot of weird homage to some of the other original Punisher movies. So it was just kind of weird that what they were doing.
Just really, really strange. Wayne Knight is in this movie. I don't know if you want to talk about Wayne Knight. He plays Microchip. He is a pseudo mentor to the Punisher, but he's in this movie for like 5 minutes and then gets shot in the head.
Yeah, I can't help but think of Jurassic Park every time I see him. So that's just me. And I know people love him in Seinfeld, but Newman, and he's always going to be the dude from Jurassic Park that fucked everything up. And I almost wanted to see him like holding a can of like shaving cream or something. It was like a throwback. But that's just me being weird because I would do weird stuff like that.
The FBI agents are useless, and they are not actual characters. Also have really terrible accents. I am giving the heroes a 2.
Yeah, the accents are really terrible. The cops are very incompetent in this movie, and they willingly admit that like they want to help Castle because these people just get away with it, and they're like, let Castle just take care of them. So I'm gonna go with a 4. I'm not satisfied with his performance, but some of the side characters were okay. Like I like that cop that's been helping him on the side. I forget his name, but he's kind of playing an aloof on purpose, so that was kind of interesting because I thought originally he was just an aloof, but he's playing an aloof on purpose, so I got that. Yeah, it's just, man, I feel bad because Ray Stevenson he's not a leading man, and you need a leading man for this, and it was just a sign of, I don't know, being on a budget, I guess, and kind of picking what you can get. So,
all right, let's talk about the villains. The villains in this movie are somehow worse than they've been in the previous 2 movies. Look, I like Dominic West. The Wire is probably my favorite television show of all time, and I'm never not going to see Dominic West as Jimmy McNulty. That, to me, in my mind, that is who he is. And every time I see him, I'm always going to associate him with The Wire, and it's going to give me very positive, fuzzy feelings. In this case, though, I mean, good Lord, just the most cartoonish of accents. The look, the way that he is designed after his accident, the way they made up his face, it's so weird. They're very clearly going for Jack Nicholson in Batman 1989, and it did not work at all. Jack Nicholson obviously is unbelievably great and can do this in his sleep. Dominic West is just not that guy. He is so bad. I can't even describe how bad he is. Like, his accent is this fake Italian New York accent that he just cannot pull off. And Dominic West has a very good American accent, as you've probably seen in a number of movies and TV shows. But my goodness, I mean, he is just not good in this movie. And when I saw that he was in it, I was at least curious. And I was hopeful that, he was going to be good, whereas the previous villains have definitely not been. But, I mean, he is as much of a cartoon as Tanaka was 2 weeks ago when we talked about the 1989 Punisher.
Yeah, it's such a disappointing thing to see because I'm a big Wire fan too, man. And, like, that character, McNulty, like, is the reason that I drink Irish whiskey, or Jameson Irish whiskey. That's my whiskey of choice. And it's because of that show, and I know that's probably a bad influence, but whatever. Having a nice shot of whiskey every once a week or something like that is fine. But yeah, it was just so bad. And then like rip off the exact scene from Batman '89, which I guess you could say Batman '89 ripped off that scene from the Twilight Zone with the ugly people and then the woman who's actually looking normal and she's actually the ugly one, blah blah blah. But yeah, we've seen it before. And, like, I don't even know how that dude survived, like, being in I don't know, like a pool of broken glass that probably should have destroyed his body. And how come, like, his body wasn't scarred up and it was just his face? I didn't get that part either. Yeah, man, his accent is just so fucking bad. Everyone's accent on the Italian family side is bad. It's like, I don't know, they just have this idea of, like, we got to sound like the dudes from Goodfellas, guys, so go for it. And you just get this cheesy... almost like Fat Tony. Where is the money? Why don't I have the money right now? You know what I mean? It's just like, ugh. I'm sick of these Italian mobster accents, man. I don't know if you can avoid it, but maybe just not make the bad guys Italian mobsters in these movies anymore. And, like, why would you go with Jigsaw when Lionsgate already produces the Saw movies with the villain character named Jigsaw? And I know Jigsaw's from the comics, but, like, as soon as I heard that, I was like, is Frank Castle about to do a crossover with the Saw series? Like, what's going on here? And then I looked it up, and Jigsaw is an actual villain. But, like, man, if we had a crossover with Saw and Punisher, I think that would have been a lot better and a lot more interesting. And Frank Castle wants to play a game, maybe.
Woof. I mean, that's all that can be said. So do you know who Doug Hutchinson is?
No, is he the brother?
So he is Looney Bin Jim. He is LBJ in this movie. He is a giant fucking creep, and he is not just a giant fucking creep in this movie, but he is a creep in real life. Do you know why, Brian?
I almost don't want to know the way you built that up.
Do you know the name Courtney Stodden?
That sounds very familiar, yes.
So you remember the 17-year-old girl, because she's underage, that married the 50-year-old guy?
Yeah.
Doug Hutchinson was that 50-year-old guy.
Oh boy. Okay. Well,
and Doug Hutchinson has also been in the news lately because basically Courtney Stodden has talked about the fact that he kind of groomed her and was kind of abusive to her in their marriage. So that's all that really can be said about Doug Hutchinson. I don't even want to talk about his performance because he's a big old creep, and that's all that can be said. I'm giving the villains a 2.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with a 2 as well. It's just yeah, he was creepy, but like I just felt like it was just the wrong kind of movie. Like, why are we doing cannibal horror in the middle of a Frank Castle Punisher movie? You know, it didn't make sense to me. But yeah, they were just going for some wacky stuff with the villains here. So
Certainly that is the case. All right, let's talk about the story for what it is. This is the third straight Punisher movie to have a ton of issues. On the one hand, it is cartoonishly violent, probably the most violent superhero movie ever made, as multiple scenes feature heads and other body parts being blown off. Then they try to have Punisher kind of experience pain, but also not talking very much. They also seemingly try to explore Punisher going too far when he kills an undercover agent, but holy shit, do things get muddled as they try to explore this FBI storyline and this gangster storyline. There's tons of absurd dialogue and bad dialogue throughout this movie.
yeah, I was not. I don't know. I didn't. I wasn't feeling the ending because it just felt like again Frank Castle overpowering everybody and having no trouble whatsoever. And then he just sets the dude on fire again. Again, the ending, the bad guy getting lit on fire and just burning and moaning and groaning. But yeah, I like the part where he shoots the FBI undercover agent, and it becomes this really interesting, like, complex relationship thing where he has to protect the daughter of the person that he killed. You know what I mean? I thought that was really interesting. So that I give it credit for because that could have been really something to explore. Like if the Punisher, I haven't seen the Punisher seasons, the Netflix show, but if they did something like that, I'd be really interested because that seems really because he seemed really conflicted and like just like fuck man, I fucking shot this innocent dude, and now like this woman and her kid are just like widowed now, and it's just like for that 5 minutes I felt bad, like ah fuck, like he really fucked up bad. But then like they kind of drift away from that plot and focus more on the villains, and then it gets wacky again. So I'll go with a 5 because I felt like they really had something really interesting with that, and then they just lost it. And then by the end of the movie, I guess she just forgives him or whatever, and then they really don't talk about it or like her forgiving him or like any like kind of dialogue that kind of has resolution to that fucked up relationship that they have. But yeah, that was the most interesting part of the story, and they kind of went away from it.
I am giving the story too. I just found this movie to be extremely unpleasant and just not fun to watch, Brian. This was not my favorite of the movies that I've watched, needless to say. Not as bad as Captain America or Catwoman, but it came pretty darn close. The technical saturated colors, which I think has been adopted by the Netflix shows, and you can certainly see the influence in a movie like John Wick. I think the score is pretty forgettable. I think the makeup on West does not look great. I think the pacing is okay. Thankfully, this movie is about 1 hour and 40 minutes, so I'm glad that they at least were able to do that. I'm giving this a 4.
This is gonna be my highest score. You might be shocked. I'm going with a 6. I almost went with a 7, but the makeup job was just so terrible on Dominic West. So, like I said, Lexi Alexander took a really like bad script, did the best that she could. Because if you look at this technically, it looks like a really well directed movie. To be honest, that's just me being honest. Like I felt like it's well directed, and it's just the problem is everything else. You know what I mean? But she did everything she could to hold this movie together. And there's some interesting like camera work that I really like. Some of the cinematography was really well done, I thought. I love the final shot. I don't know how you feel about that, but the final shot where they actually program the cross to have the light fade out, and then the last thing that says is to save me. So there was some interesting like visual stuff that they were going for. Like I said, the hyper action style of the time, where you see like the dude doing parkour in between the buildings and just getting blown up in between buildings. I did not see that coming. I had to stop the movie for a second and go like, "What the fuck?" and then rewind it and then kind of full grasp of what just happened. So yeah, it's got some interesting like I don't know how you feel about the lighting, but I like the look of the lighting and the way that the Netflix shows use it. I just kind of have that. I don't know. It appeals to me in the way that they use the colors. So maybe we're just a little different on the aesthetic part of that, but that's kind of like where I'm at. And the music wasn't that memorable either, but that was a problem. And again, like I feel like these movies need like a heavy metal, hard rock kind of soundtrack, and they use some of that at the end. but I think you got to go full with it like Craig did, and that's why Craig was so enjoyable, because I thought they really had fun with the soundtrack, and these movies don't have fun with the soundtrack at all.
I certainly did like some of the neon lighting choices, and there are aspects of the Netflix shows that I like from a visual standpoint that I'm glad that they were able to do, especially if you're going for the darker tone. I don't know. I think for me, I think just some of the violence, it was kind of absurd, and that's kind of why I came down as hard as I did. But I certainly think the directing is the strongest part of it. And now we can talk about the legacy. This is the first Marvel film to be directed by a woman. And that is something that cannot be taken away. This apparently has a cult following. This is something that Ben Phillips was telling me about. And apparently it's true. Patton Oswalt apparently is a huge fan of this movie. And they're apparently, how did this get made? Both he and the director, Lexi Alexander, went onto the podcast to talk about the movie. There's apparently an episode of Fat Man on Batman about this, which, Brian, that may interest you. But this is also, funny enough, the lowest grossing Marvel movie of all time. And Punisher was given back to Marvel shortly after this. Thankfully, the TV show is probably the best Punisher that has ever been rendered up to this point. I'm giving The Legacy a 4.
Same score as you. Yeah, it's just weird that like this movie grossed $8 million. They released it in December. It's almost as if it was designed to fail, given the amount of budget that was given, and then all the meddling that Lionsgate had. It was like they wanted it to fail, and I don't know. She tried her best, man, and that's why I felt like she deserved a lot more coming out of this. Because like I look at her, filmography, and she's been very outspoken about the discrepancy with female directors, and it's obvious, man, because she's got a lot of talent, I think, and I don't know, she could be doing more action movies now, I think, and I would give her, like, she never directed any of the Netflix Marvel shows, and I think that's a waste, because she could have done so much for those shows, I think, but that's just me thinking out loud, but, yeah, it's kind of a shame, considering that she is the first female Marvel director, and then just the shit that you have to go through, and then dealing with Lionsgate out of all companies, and Lionsgate is, like we said, not the biggest and best of companies in the movie world, so it was just a lot of things going against this movie.
Certainly that is the case. My total score is a 14.
21, so again, more of these discrepancies, but I guess we're
another enormous discrepancy between us. This is really remarkable.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, man. Just, I guess different things kind of click on different, for different people. We have our different styles and, things that we like, but maybe it's just certain things that kind of popped up in each movie. But again, like the one thing that I will say for all three of these Punisher movies is like they don't get the score down at all. Like the soundtrack is just, I think, a big part of what these movies needed, and they just totally shit the bed on that. So
I would certainly agree with you on that. There has not been a memorable track on any of these songs or any of these movies, and it's really unfortunate. So now we're going to play a couple of games, Brian, as we get into the burning questions. You will first rank the Punisher movies: 1989, 2004, Warzone. I'm going to play this game first. I'm going to put Warzone in third place. I'm going to put 1989 in second, and then in first place with a score of 22, the 2004 Punisher. That is my quote-unquote favorite of the three.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure if the scores add up to what I'm about to say, but I'll say 89 Punisher is 1, all because of Lou Gossett Jr. and my obsession with Dolph Lundgren, and I just kind of felt more satisfied at the end of that one than any of these other two. Number 2, I'll go with Warzone. Like I said, very well directed, just really shitty everything else. And then number 3, I'll go with 2004. John Travolta and his really shitty performance, and then that moaning at the end I almost wanted to stop the movie, even though I had 2 minutes left, and I was like, just sit for the last 2 minutes, man. Just sit for the last 2 minutes.
Rank the Punishers: Dolph Lundgren, Thomas Jane, and Ray Stevenson.
Okay, let's go with Dolph Lundgren number 1. I'll go Thomas Jane number 2, Ray Stevenson number 3. Ray Stevenson definitely has the physicality for it. It's just he doesn't have the emotion to back up the everything else, you know what I mean? And then Thomas Jane, like I said, I'll watch the short film again that he made in 2012, bring back the Punisher character. Maybe he just needs to grow into it. Maybe it'll be that Brandon Routh moment where I'm totally blown away with Brandon Routh as Superman now than I was in 2006. So shit can change.
I am going to put Thomas Jane number 1 with a bullet, pun very much intended. Dolph Lundgren number 2 and Ray Stevenson number 3. I don't think Ray Stevenson was appropriate at all for this role, and it did not work. All right, Brian, this is the first time. So we ask this question a lot here on this podcast, but in this case, there is a right answer. What did John Travolta do with his paycheck from Punisher?
I'm going to guess, because I don't know the exact answer, which it seems like you do. I'll say either a boat or a helicopter.
He donated all to Scientology. Come on, Brian.
Okay, well, I didn't expect the whole paycheck to go to Scientology, but that probably explains why that they got some new buildings up in Hollywood around that time. So there you go.
Exactly. Should there be any more solo Punisher movies? I say no. I do not think that solo Punisher movies, I just don't think they work.
Yeah, it's got to be team up. Like, it's got to be like a team up with like a character. I don't know. Like, I think of the Spider-Man episode from the '90s show and how well that worked. But then again, it's like that was a different, more toned down Punisher. So it's gonna be difficult, man. Because what's his name? John Bernthal. I think he's the best Punisher to date, even though he was never in a movie. But he's perfect to just kind of throw up there and do as a team up. You know what I mean? I think a team up, and you kind of tone him down, don't have him say the F word every now and then, and kind of tone the violence down a little bit. It can work. But yeah, as a movie, solo movie, no, because I mean, goddamn, it's 3 movies in a row we've seen his freaking family get killed, and then you watch the show, and it's the 4th time you watch his family get killed. It's like, okay, we've seen enough. It's like we've seen Uncle Ben die so many times already. So yeah, just get away from that, tell a new story, and maybe have no flashbacks whatsoever anymore to his family at all.
That is certainly the case. How could the Punisher be introduced in the MCU?
I guess just do what the '90s show did, right? If you're gonna do like a Kraven the Hunter type thing, and then you got all these people hunting Spider-Man, and all of a sudden it kind of gets intertwined with Frank Castle and what he's doing, and then you realize this kid is like on the run and he needs help, and they kind of run into each other. That's kind of how I would do it, but obviously they don't want to put Frank Castle in Spider-Man 3. But that's something that a way you can tie it in. I almost kind of see Frank Castle in like the whole Winter Soldier um, Falcon kind of show kind of thing, because he fits that kind of tone. Like, I can kind of see Punisher in that world and kind of excelling and kind of going to like, because he's like in the show anyway, he was part of the like a military cover up or something. So there's already that kind of like, dark seedious there, or dark elements kind of there with the bad guys, and you can cross them over easily. Maybe have something to do with like the benefactor or whatever in the MCU. That's kind of been, that rumored role that's been going around. So there's a lot of ways you can tie him in. The problem is you got to keep it, at the right tone, because if you tone him down too much, the audience are going to notice like, God, this is like not the same, and it's going to affect the overall quality, I think.
I could certainly see that being the case, and I think it's going to be really hard to put a character who was almost specifically designed to be in R-rated movies and put him into this PG-13 universe. So I think it's going to be really hard to incorporate the Punisher. I think, if anything, he's going to get a series on Hulu. I have no doubt that they are going to reboot this character and try it again. But fitting him into the MCU is going to be really, really hard. So with that, Brian, we can officially put the Punisher movies to bed. And next week, we will be reviewing just one movie. But what a movie it is, Brian. Why don't you talk about it?
Okay, so we're watching Daredevil, but I haven't seen Daredevil since the theaters, right? And everyone that has bought the DVD or whatever has told me that you got to watch the director's cut, because it is a significantly better movie. And I still haven't watched it, so we saved it. We're going to watch it with all this Ben Affleck stuff about his new movie coming out, and him, in the news about the Snyder Cut still being a thing and all that kind of thing. And we can talk about that, and him kind of coming back from his alcoholism and how the Batman role almost killed him, apparently. So we can talk about that, and talk about Colin Farrell also being in the Batman coming out next year, who's the villain in Daredevil. So there's a lot of things we can talk about. It's going to be the director's cut. It's going to be fresh for me because, like I said, I haven't seen it in years, and this director's cut is apparently way better. So it'll be interesting to watch.
It certainly will be. So for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you next week to talk about Ben Devil.
I think you're going to need a bigger gun.